This is music, and this is my musical journey. At some point between Christmas and New Year's Eve, this channel reached 1,000 subscribers, which I really appreciate. I think it was maybe December 27th, 28th, but I really appreciate it because I make these videos for fun, so it's unbelievable to me that 1,000 people, probably some bots in there too, but the people want to watch my videos. I'm really grateful. So I want to say thanks to everybody who's watched my videos, who's liked them, who's commented on them, who's hate watched them. Obviously, thanks to all the subscribers, and a special thanks to all the vinyl community and music community channels here on YouTube who have supported my channel. Thank you, all of you. I will launch a contest to celebrate this and to give something back to the viewers. I just want it to be a contest that's fun, straightforward, and simple, and also a contest that includes what I believe to be the major, I guess, categories of viewers of this channel, like people who collect physical music media, people who like metal music, and people that like J rock and J metal. So I have a couple of ideas, and as soon as I settle on the right idea for how to do the contest, I will launch it, and hopefully it'll be fun, simple, and straightforward. But I figured it would also be fun to maybe celebrate this by also making some videos in genres that you don't normally see on this channel. And what better genre of video than a "This is my musical journey" video. But I'll combine it with another genre you've never seen on this channel as well, and that is the timeline genre. So, I am going to tell you my musical story. I've put together a timeline that kind of roughly accounts for how I ended up the weirdo I am. So, let's switch to the timeline. Okay, so how did a person who could have become a well adjusted individual in society end up like this? Let's go on a musical journey. Now, you got some years at the bottom, they're just arbitrary, to be honest. The timeline starts in 1980. I was around before that, but it was around 1980 that I started thinking consciously about the music that I was listening to. And yeah, like so many other people, the first music in my life was music that my parents would listen to mainly. So I grew up on a steady diet of 80s pop and 80s rock. My dad had a copy of Synchronicity on cassette tape that I remember listening to a lot. And I remember liking a lot of, 80s pop and 80s rock. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm one of those Stranger Things kids, I guess. But my parents would also listen to a lot of 70s rock and 60s rock because that's what they would listen to when they were young, right? And in particular, the Beatles made a huge impact on me. In particular, uh, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band and a compilation that my parents had on cassette tape that we would listen to in the car stereo all the time. So the Beatles were probably my first favorite band. Now, in 1984, that's when I was exposed to heavy metal for the first time, except I didn't know it was called heavy metal. It was Twisted Sister from Stay Hungry. Obviously, We're Not Gonna Take It, and I Wanna Rock. And I was more fascinated with the colorful image of the band and the funny music videos in the short term than I was with the music. In the long term, it's actually those two songs, it's the music that stays with me. But although this was the first metal I ever heard, this was not my favorite type of music. My first favorite type of music outside of what my parents were listening to, that was actually breakdance music. I had a bunch of breakdance compilations on cassette tape with some legit kind of breakdance songs. I would say like some Grandmaster Flash, New York, New York, Rockhead as well, street dance, break dance, Buffalo Gals, and the Rock City Crew song. But there were also some questionable breakdance songs on like Radio Gaga, Relax, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. They're actually all of them are actually on this particular album that I did have on cassette tape. Another funny thing about these compilations was that the original artists never really performed on them. It was always cover versions by weird unknown artists. But yeah, my first favorite kind of music outside of what my parents listened to, that was breakdance music, along with movie music. And we're still in 1984, because in this year I also started paying attention to the music in movies, and I loved the soundtrack from the Ghostbusters and from the Karate Kid, and I also loved the classical scores, especially John Williams' work from the late 70s and early 80s, and of course the Star Wars music, and not surprisingly, the Imperial March from The Empire Strikes Back, my favorite music or my favorite movie of all time. Probably my favorite soundtrack of all time too, if I'm being honest. Um, but yeah, my first favorite type of music, that was not metal. This was to change somewhere in either the summer or fall of 88, or maybe the spring summer of 89, when I heard Iron Maiden for the first time. I was aware of Iron Maiden because I knew the artwork, Eddie, and all that stuff. I just had never heard them before. But yeah, we went on a fishing trip near a power plant. One of the older kids had brought a boombox, one cassette tape that was Somewhere in Time. I was completely hooked immediately, unlike the fish, because we didn't catch anything that day. As soon as I could, I went out and bought a copy of Somewhere in Time on cassette tape for my own allowance money. And that was the first music release I ever bought for my own money. All the other stuff I had was like birthday presents and stuff. The second thing I ever bought for my own money was Killers on cassette tape. And over the next couple of years, I would explore, you know, 80s metal and hard rock. AC/DC became huge in my life too. My parents gave me a copy of Flick of the Switch. And yeah, AC/DC, my second favorite band of all time. Iron Maiden, my favorite band of all time. And from here, my journey into metal music started. I discovered Running Wild, Judas Priest, and I think Halloween too, and a bunch of other bands in our local music library. One of my dad's colleagues would record dub tapes of Iron Maiden albums for me. He was happy to do that. My aunt would dub Guns N' Roses and Disneyland After Dark for me. And, I had other friends who also got into metal and hard rock, and we would copy tapes and stuff for each other, and so on. So we didn't have the internet back then, so that's how we relied on music primarily. Because we were kids, we couldn't afford buying like music magazines and stuff either. So it was the music library, uh, family and friends, and maybe presents from our parents. My parents gave me a Bon Jovi tape for Christmas. Then in 1990, I discovered thrash metal. I resisted it at first because it was a little bit too aggressive and fast, but when I heard And Justice for All, I decided to give it a chance, took it home from the music library, put it on, was mesmerized by how weird it sounded, how fast and aggressive a lot of the music was, but it was also melodic, and there was a lot of stuff going on. It seemed kind of complex. So that album, And Justice for All, got me into thrash metal. So I went back and kind of, explored the earlier Metallica output. I also got into Megadeth and, lots of other thrash metal bands uh, in this period in time, like the very early 90s. Now, the 90s were kind of a confusing decade and a confused decade. And they're seen as a dark time for metal nowadays, but back then they were awesome. There was so much going on. I discovered so many artists and genres in the 90s, and I was also in bands myself because I'd learned to play the guitar and I would join, you know, hard rock bands. I was in a thrash groove metal band. We even put out demo tapes and stuff in that band. I was in a short-lived death metal band. I had a short stint in a doom metal band. I was even in a hardcore band for a while, a very, very short while, I have to say, and even in an alternative metal band. So the 80s, sorry, the 90s were my formative decade. Part of the 80s too, but mostly the 90s. Now, the 90s, that was the decade of alternative rock and alternative metal and grunge. While I liked Nevermind, I actually didn't really like grunge that much, but I was into other types of alternative metal, especially funk metal and rap metal, before it was new metal. Loved Rage Against the Machine, Faith No More, Clawfinger, all that stuff. And of course, I was still a thrasher. I was still exploring thrash metal. I was exploring like softer and more melodic thrash metal, Flotsam and Jetsam, Forte, but also harsher stuff. I resisted it. I resisted the harsh kind of like death thrash in the beginning because I couldn't stomach the vocals. But you know, Sepultura, Arise, and similar albums won me over, and I got into that harsher style of thrash metal too. Um, I also got into doom metal around the same time. Interestingly enough, right? Because doom metal is kind of the opposite of thrash metal, and I was fascinated with the choice to play slow and sad songs rather than fast and aggressive songs. I got into Solitude Aeternus and Count Raven first, Candlemas, and also Saint Vitus. So epic and traditional doom metal. And to this day, that's what I prefer. That and Death Doom. I got into Death Doom a little bit later, but I still can't really get into sludge metal and stoner metal for some reason. It's part of the doom metal universe too, but I don't know. I just can't. Uh, Now, my interest in doom metal also got me interested in Black Sabbath, their early stuff, because that was quite doomy, and that in turn got me interested in like proto metal, early heavy metal, 70s hard rock too, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple. I count Jimi Hendrix as part of that whole thing as well. Uh, Deep Purple left and Black Sabbath, I would say they left a huge impression on me. Jimi Hendrix too. For some reason, Led Zeppelin didn't. I don't dislike Led Zeppelin, just didn't do as much for me for some reason as those other bands did. But it was pretty cool to kind of discover the harder stuff that my dad was listening to when he was young. I also got into power metal in the 90s, early 90s. Both the European cheesy kind, it wasn't too cheesy back then, it was good cheese. I did know Halloween and Running Wild already, but I also got big into Blind Guardian. And I learned that power metal is fun to listen to when you bicycle to school. Doom metal is not fun because you end up bicycling really slowly and you're always late. I liked both, the Euro power metal at the time and the heavier US power metal. Now, to us back in the day, power metal was heavier and faster and more aggressive than traditional metal, but not as heavy and fast and aggressive as thrash metal. So it was kind of like the missing link between, not missing, but the link between traditional metal and thrash and speed metal. That's how we looked at it back then. I know it's different now. Uh, and I also got into like the underground scene. I was a marginal part of it myself, being in a bunch of bands, and we would go to a lot of local shows, underground shows around town in Odense where I grew up, and we would always make sure to buy demo tapes from the artists. I have some of those demo tapes still today, and I'm picking up whenever I find them in the wild. I'm happy to buy a demo tape that I either had back then and lost or never had. The one you see on screen, actually, I never had that one on cassette tape. I would love to have it. One of my friends had it. I hope he still does. Uh, so yeah, and of course, groove metal, another maligned metal genre nowadays. But back in the early '90s, there was a very short peak period when it was just awesome groove metal that came out. especially those three Pantera albums from the early 90s. They were fantastic. They still are. And I loved groove metal back then. Granted, the genre got watered down really quickly, but in the early 90s, when groove metal was awesome, it was perfect for angsty teenage boys with low self esteem, right? That's probably why we liked it. We could feel a bit masculine, of course. Looking back, it's all the machismo is stupid, but I liked groove metal. There was something primal about those groove metal riffs. I still love it. I mean, the groove metal from back then. It is watered down now. Now, while a lot of these genres I've talked about were like heavier genres, I also kind of got back to the softer side. So my musical journey is not like a linear one towards more and more aggressive music. It's more like all over the place. Uh, I discovered Def Leppard very late in the early 90s. One of my friends was a Def Leppard fan, and he was also a singer in one of the bands I was in. And he had Hysteria, and we would sit around and listen to it at his place, and really liked it. So that got me into Kicks and Dirty Looks and Motley Crue and Rat and all that stuff. I had heard some of it before, I think, on the radio, not knowing what it was. You know, similar to Twisted Sister. So yeah, I liked glam and thrash at the same time. Crazy. I also quite liked rap music. Um, 80s rap, early 90s rap, especially Danish language rap, especially two artists, MC Einar and Rockers by Choice. But I also liked some English language rap artists like Grandmaster Flash, Public Enemy, Run DMC, and a Tribe Called Quest, and that sort of stuff. I don't like modern rap music nowadays, but I still enjoy listening to 80s and 90s rap music. And I also got into more above ground Danish rock music, the more alternative style. Dizzy Miss Lizzy, Kashmir, Hotel Hunger. Uh, Also, Boghandle, they were kind of like a really dirty grunge band from Denmark. I have a soft spot for Dizzy Miss Lizzy. I still have to this day. Now, I had a really hard time getting into death metal in the early 90s. I just couldn't stomach the vocals. In 95, however, a good friend of mine from high school lent me his copy of Death Symbolic, and I listened to it, and it clicked, and I finally got it. I finally got death metal. There were some death metal bands before that I liked. Entombed, Bolt Thrower, Cemetery, Obituary, but it was Symbolic that kind of made the genre click, and by extension, all the other kind of like subgenres and crossover genres like death and roll and death doom and death grind and all that stuff. So this is a super important moment in my musical journey. So while I really enjoyed listening to the contemporary metal of the early 90s, by 97 I kind of lost interest in the metal music that was coming out because it was like new metal and you know power metal had become watered down, groove metal, forget about it, and thrash metal had become kind of weird. I still enjoyed listening to the music I had always been listening to, like 80s thrash, early 90s thrash, 70s hard rock, and 80s metal, and power metal from the early 90s and late 80s and stuff. But I had to kind of look beyond metal, uh, like in the late 90s, to get some interesting music. So that kind of like led me back to the 80s, and I kind of went back into 80s pop and 80s rock, and I became a huge fan of Depeche Mode. I would listen to that constantly. I also, got into some 70s hard rock bands that I had missed out on to begin with. Thin Lizzy's stuff. I got into world music. I got into the blues. I got into folk music, even some electronic music. I already liked the Prodigy. I hated uh, bubblegum disco, aqua stuff, but there was some like more alternative electronic music that I liked. So yeah, the late 90s, they weren't that interesting to me, if I'm being honest. Uh, but then in 2000, Iron Maiden put out Brave New World, and I realized there's still interesting stuff going on in the world of metal. You just have to look for it. Um, Interestingly enough, I started with progressive metal. I actually started with progressive rock. Um, I got into like classic prog rock bands, Genesis, Yes, Gentle Giant, all that stuff, and that was because I knew that Steve Harris liked it from Iron Maiden. Uh, but I had also picked up a copy of Invisible Touch that I liked, and that got me into it as well. And I'm sorry, but to me, 19125 by Yes, that is a prog album. I'm sorry, to me it is. It's clean cut 80s neo prog kind of stuff, but it's prog rock. But that also got me into a lot of other genres of progressive music, like alternative rock with progressive leanings, jazz fusion, and of course progressive metal. I already knew and liked Queensryche, but in this period, so the first decade of the 2000s, I really got into it. Like everything in prog metal. Queensryche, Fates Warning, Dream Theater, extreme stuff like Atheist, and even more extreme stuff like Obscura. Death, of course, played a big role in this too, because their music had become quite progressive too. So I explored a lot of progressive metal, and through that, I started looking at the contemporary metal scene again. And yeah, you had the metalcore scene was big, deathcore was big, and I didn't like those genres. Um, I didn't like anything about it. Yeah, I liked early Killswitch Engage, God forbid, Shadows Fall. That's about it. Um, there's also still new metal, but that was boring to me, if I'm being honest. And but one thing that was really interesting was that a lot of those old genres were going through a revival phase. So you had both kind of modern variants of those old genres, and you had like retro variants of those old genres by new bands, and you had old bands reforming, putting out new stuff that was awesome. You had old bands kind of getting their act together and putting out good stuff again. um, so that was great. I liked this era, apart from the metalcore and deathcore and new metal stuff. I have to be honest. Nothing against people who like those genres, and I do think they are metal genres. They just, I just don't like that music for some reason. I also finally got around to catching up on a lot of those '90s bands that I missed out on back then, like a lot of the death metal stuff, some glam and hard rock bands, and some grindcore even. And I finally decided it was time to get into black metal. Uh, Back in the '90s, I could definitely hear that bands like Immortal and Emperor had stuff that I think might appeal to me, but there was also a lot of that really lo-fi stuff that I just wasn't ready for, so I decided to push it until I was ready, and now I was ready. And yeah, so I finally got into black metal too. And so to this day, I'm still exploring metal. Now I'm enjoying going back and revisiting bands I didn't like back then. Slayer, by the way, I didn't like him back in the day, uh, for some reason. And then I went back and I gave him a chance, and I actually liked pretty much everything they put out. And I'm lucky that I think that I could go back and listen to a lot of bands in that kind of retrospective fashion, because I don't dislike the newer Slayer stuff. I actually like that just as much as the older Slayer stuff, because I didn't have any connection to the old stuff back in the day. Um, so yeah, I'm enjoying exploring heavy metal to this day, all sorts of different genres, and I also got into J rock and J metal like in the 2010s. Um, by As a coincidence, I picked up a blind buy, really cheap, a band called Vigilante, a progressive metal band from Japan. Really liked it. I asked a friend of mine who is Japanese if he could recommend some more stuff, and he recommended a band called Maximum the Hormone, in particular a song called Tsume Tsume Tsume. Listened to it, loved it because it was so weird, and that got me into J rock and J metal as well. So that is where I am today. I like a lot of different genres of music, almost all genres of metal, a lot of stuff beyond metal, and I like a lot of Japanese metal and rock too. And so there you go. That was my musical journey on this timeline. So there you have it in, I guess, a bird's eye view, my musical journey. That's how I ended up the weirdo I am today. Again, thanks to everybody who subscribed to this channel, who supported it, who watched the videos and liked and commented and all that stuff. I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.